The morning sun painted golden streaks across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace. But inside the grand halls, darkness was brewing. Queen Camilla stood before her private mirror, adjusting her emerald necklace with trembling fingers. She had no idea that this would be the last time she would wear her royal jewels as a free woman. In the palace kitchen, Chef Margaret whispered urgently to her assistant while preparing the morning tea. The news had spread like wildfire among the staff during the night. Secret documents had been discovered, documents that would change everything. Margaret had seen the serious faces of the investigators as they walked through the corridors at dawn. Their leather briefcases clutched tightly in their hands. The royal secretary, James Harrison, paced nervously in his office. He had been the one to find the hidden safe behind the portrait of King Charles. Inside that safe were papers that revealed a shocking truth about Queen Camilla's past activities. Financial records, secret communications, and evidence of dealings that no member of the royal family should ever be involved in. King Charles sat in his study, his face pale and drawn. He had not slept all night after James brought him the devastating evidence. The papers spread across his mahogany desk told a story of betrayal, corruption, and crimes that reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined. His wife, the woman he had loved and defended for decades, had been living a double life. The evidence showed that Camilla had been secretly funneling royal funds to offshore accounts. But that was not the worst part. The documents revealed her involvement with a criminal organization that had been using her royal position to launder money and influence political decisions across Europe. Phone records showed conversations with known criminals, and bank statements revealed millions of pounds moving through accounts she had hidden from everyone, including her husband. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins arrived at the palace gates as the morning fog began to lift. She had been investigating this criminal network for 3 years, never imagining that the trail would lead her to the very heart of the British monarchy. Her team of specialists followed behind her, each carrying the legal documents that would allow them to arrest a sitting queen. Inside the palace, Camilla was having breakfast in the blue drawing room, completely unaware of the storm approaching. She chatted casually with her lady-in-waiting about the upcoming charity gala, planning which dress to wear and which dignitaries to invite. The irony was not lost on those who knew the truth. She was planning to attend a charity event while secretly stealing money that was meant to help the poor. The palace guards had been briefed early that morning by their commander. They stood at their posts with heavy hearts, knowing that they would soon have to perform one of the most difficult duties in their careers. Many of them had served the royal family for decades and had never imagined they would have to arrest a queen. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hart received the call at 7 in the morning. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm, King Charles himself, informing her of the situation and asking for her government's full cooperation with the investigation. The Prime Minister knew that this scandal would rock the nation to its core and potentially threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. News. Reporters gathered outside the palace gates, though they did not yet know why. Palace staff had noticed the unusual activity, and word had begun to spread that something significant was happening. Television vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward, ready to broadcast whatever news would emerge from behind those famous iron gates in her private chambers. Camilla's personal assistant Maria quietly packed a small bag. She had overheard conversations between the senior staff and knew what was coming. Maria had always suspected that her employer was involved in activities that went beyond normal royal duties, but she had chosen to remain silent. Now she wished she had spoken up sooner. The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned to the palace for an emergency meeting. As the spiritual leader of the Church of England, he needed to be prepared for the religious and moral implications of what was about to unfold. The monarchy had always been closely tied to the Church, and this scandal would test that relationship in ways that had not been seen for centuries. European authorities had been coordinating with British police throughout the night. The criminal network that Camilla had been involved with had tentacles reaching across the continent, and simultaneous arrests were being planned in France, Germany, and Italy. Her connections had helped facilitate crimes ranging from tax evasion to human trafficking. and justice systems across Europe were finally closing in. King Charles made the most difficult decision of his life. He authorized the arrest of his own wife, knowing that it would destroy their marriage and potentially end his reign. But he also knew that the monarchy could only survive if it stood for justice and integrity. Even when that meant sacrificing the person he loved most, the legal team that had been secretly assembled over the past week reviewed their case one final time. They had testimony from whistleblowers, financial records spanning 15 years, recorded conversations, and physical evidence that painted a clear picture of guilt. There would be no escape from justice, regardless of royal titles or connections. As 10 o'clock approached, the palace fell into an eerie silence. Staff members went about their duties with heavy hearts, knowing that history was about to be made. The cleaning ladies whispered prayers, the gardeners tended to their flowers with unusual care, and the guards stood a little straighter at their posts. Queen Camilla finished her morning correspondence, completely unaware that investigators were already inside the palace, making final preparations for her arrest. She had successfully hidden her criminal activities for so long that she had begun to believe she was untouchable. The royal protection that had once kept her safe had now become the very thing that ensured she could not escape justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the British monarchy forever. In just a few hours, the woman who had climbed from controversy to become Queen of England would find herself facing the consequences of choices she had made in the shadows. The palace walls that had protected her secrets were about to witness her downfall in the most public and dramatic way imaginable. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins walked through the palace corridors with measured steps, her team flanking her on both sides. The ornate paintings and golden decorations seemed to mock the gravity of their mission. Behind them, palace officials followed nervously, their faces showing the strain of this unprecedented situation. Queen Camilla was in the rose garden, cutting flowers for the state dinner arrangements, when her lady-in-waiting approached with an unusual request. The queen was needed immediately in the throne room for an urgent matter. Camilla set down her garden shears, brushing dirt from her hands, annoyed at the interruption to her peaceful morning routine. King Charles stood in the throne room, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out the tall windows at the crowds gathering beyond the palace gates. News crews had multiplied, and reporters were speculating wildly about the increased security and unusual activity. He had not told Camilla about the evidence or the impending arrest, hoping against hope that somehow the investigators had made a mistake. The palace's senior staff assembled in the Great Hall, whispering among themselves. The Lord Chamberlain had called an emergency meeting, though he could not yet reveal the true reason. Cook's staff, housekeepers, secretaries, and gardeners all gathered, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. Many had worked at the palace for decades and had never experienced such tension. Maria, Camilla's personal assistant, watched from a window as police vehicles discreetly positioned themselves around the palace grounds. Her heart pounded as she realized her suspicions about the Queen's secret activities were about to be confirmed. She had seen the late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings, and the financial documents that Camilla thought were hidden. The Queen's security detail received new instructions that confused and concerned them. They were told to step back from their normal protective positions and allow other authorities to take control. These loyal officers had sworn to protect the Queen with their lives, and now they were being asked to stand aside. While she was taken into custody, Camilla entered the throne room wearing her favorite blue dress and pearls, expecting perhaps a brief meeting about upcoming royal engagements. Instead, she found her husband standing solemnly beside Detective Inspector Collins and a team of serious-looking officials. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and for the first time, she felt a flutter of concern. Detective Inspector Collins stepped forward, her voice clear and professional as she began to speak. The words seemed to echo off the ancient walls as she addressed the Queen by her formal title and informed her that she was under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and corruption. The charges were read slowly and deliberately, each one landing like a hammer blow. Camilla's face went white as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She looked desperately at her husband, searching his eyes for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. Instead, she saw pain, disappointment, and the unmistakable confirmation that he knew about her crimes. Her knees nearly buckled as she realized that her carefully hidden double life had finally been exposed. The queen attempted to maintain her composure, drawing on years of royal training and public appearances. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, trying to project the dignity expected of her position, even as her world crumbled around her. But her hands shook as she asked what evidence they claimed to have against her. Detective. Collins opened a briefcase and began presenting the evidence systematically. Bank records showing millions of pounds transferred to secret accounts, recorded phone conversations with known criminals, and documents bearing Camilla's signature authorizing illegal transactions. Each piece of evidence was presented with calm professionalism, building an undeniable case of guilt. King Charles found his voice and spoke, directly to his wife, for what would be the last time as a free woman. His words were measured, but filled with profound sadness, as he told her that he had seen all the evidence, and that her guilt was beyond question. The betrayal cut deeper than any political scandal or personal disappointment he had ever faced. The queen's carefully constructed facade finally began to crack. She demanded to speak with her lawyers, insisting that there had been some terrible misunderstanding. But as more evidence was presented, her protests became weaker and less convincing. The weight of her crimes was simply too great to deny or explain away. Palace staff members who had gathered in nearby rooms could hear raised voices. From the throne room, word spread quickly through the servant. New, or KS, that something extraordinary was happening. Some of the older staff members remembered previous royal scandals, but nothing had prepared them for the possibility of seeing their queen arrested. Outside the palace, crowds had grown larger as news of the unusual activity spread through social media. Television reporters speculated about everything from health emergencies to terrorist threats, never imagining that they were witnessing the prelude to one of the most shocking arrests in British history. The Queen's lawyer was summoned to the palace by urgent telephone call, but he was told he would not be permitted to interfere with the arrest process. Legal protocols for arresting a member of the royal family had been carefully reviewed by constitutional experts, ensuring that justice would proceed despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Detective Collins produced a pair of handcuffs, explaining that while she would show respect for the Queen's position, she must follow proper arrest procedures. The sight of the metal restraints seemed to finally make Camilla understand that this was not a negotiation or a misunderstanding that could be resolved with royal privilege. Queen made one last desperate attempt to assert her authority, reminding everyone in the room of her position and the potential consequences of their actions. She threatened political repercussions and warned that arresting a sitting monarch would damage Britain's reputation around the world. Her words fell on deaf ears, as everyone present understood that justice must be served, regardless of titles or status. King Charles gave a barely perceptible nod to Detective Collins, the signal that she should proceed with the arrest. This simple gesture represented the most painful decision of his life, but also demonstrated his commitment to the rule of law over personal loyalty. The monarchy would survive this scandal only if it showed that no one, not even a queen, was above justice. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Camilla's wrists, the sound seemed to reverberate through the centuries-old room. The Queen of England, who had once been the most powerful woman in Britain, was now just another criminal suspect. Her royal titles and ceremonial powers meant nothing in the face of overwhelming evidence of her guilt. The walk from the throne room to the palace exit would become one of the most famous journeys in royal history. Guards who had once bowed to Camilla now stood at attention as she was led past them in chains. The woman who had demanded respect and reverence was experiencing the ultimate humiliation. Stripped of dignity and authority by her own criminal choices, the palace corridors had never witnessed such a scene in their long history. Queen Camilla, her hands secured behind her back with gleaming metal handcuffs, walked slowly between Detective Inspector Collins and a female officer. Her royal blue dress, which had looked so elegant just an hour earlier, now seemed like a costume from another life. Each step echoed through the marble hallways, creating a rhythm that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Palace staff members lined the corridors, having abandoned their usual duties to witness this extraordinary moment. Some covered their mouths in shock, others whispered prayers, and a few simply stared in disbelief. The head butler, who had served the royal family for 30 years, felt tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched the woman he had once called Your Majesty being led away like a common criminal. King Charles followed at a distance, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Royal protocol demanded that he maintain his dignity even in this darkest hour. But those who knew him well could see the devastation in his eyes. His security detail flanked him protectively, though it was unclear whether they were shielding him from physical danger or from the emotional impact of watching his marriage collapse in such a public manner. The Queen's personal maid, Susan, who had dressed her mistress every morning for the past 5 years, broke down completely when she saw Camilla in handcuffs. She had always believed that the Queen was a good person, who genuinely cared about charitable causes and the welfare of the British people. The revelation of her criminal activities felt like a personal betrayal to those who had served her faithfully. News of the arrest spread through the palace, staff like wildfire. In the kitchen, the head chef accidentally dropped a tray of fine china when he heard the news from a breathless housemaid. The crash echoed through the room, and the broken pieces seemed to symbolize how the royal household itself was shattering. Nobody seemed to know what to do or say in the face of such unprecedented events. Detective Inspector Collins maintained her professional composure as she guided the former Queen through the palace. She had arrested murderers, drug dealers, and corrupt politicians throughout her career, but nothing had prepared her for the surreal experience of handcuffing British royalty. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she realized that her actions would be studied and analyzed for generations to come. The Queen's lawyer, Robert Blackwood, arrived at the palace just as the arrest was taking place. He demanded immediate access to his client and threatened legal action against anyone who prevented him from exercising his professional duties. However, he was politely but firmly informed that normal arrest procedures would be followed, and he would have access to the Queen only after she was properly processed at the police station. Outside the palace gates, the crowd had grown to several thousand people. Many were tourists who had come to see the traditional changing of the guard ceremony, but instead found themselves witnessing the most shocking royal scandal in modern British history. Mobile phones captured every moment as police vehicles moved into position, and reporters provided breathless commentary to television audiences around the world. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hart convened an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the constitutional implications of arresting a sitting queen. Legal experts debated whether Camilla would retain her royal titles while facing criminal charges, and what procedures would need to be followed to ensure that justice was served while maintaining the stability of the British government. The Archbishop of Canterbury knelt in his private chapel, praying for guidance on how the Church of England should respond to this crisis. The monarchy and the Church had been intertwined for centuries, and the arrest of a queen on criminal charges raised profound questions about moral authority and divine appointment that had no historical precedent. European law enforcement agencies coordinated simultaneous raids across the continent as they moved to dismantle the criminal network that Camilla had been part of. In Paris, Milan, and Berlin, suspects were arrested in luxury hotels and private offices, their shocked faces captured by security cameras, as they realized their royal connection could no longer protect them. Inside the palace, King Charles retreated to his private study, where he called an emergency meeting with his closest advisors. The future of the monarchy hung in the balance, and difficult decisions needed to be made quickly. Should he abdicate in shame, or should he remain on the throne to help restore dignity and trust to the institution that had been so badly damaged by his wife's crimes? The Queen's children from her first marriage received urgent phone calls informing them of their mother's arrest. They struggled to process the news that the woman who had raised them, and whom they thought they knew so well, had been living a secret life as a criminal. The shame and embarrassment would follow them for the rest of their lives. Regardless of their own innocence, television networks around the world interrupted regular programming to report on the unprecedented arrest. Royal correspondents who had covered decades of palace news found themselves without adequate vocabulary to describe what was happening. The phrase "Queen arrested for criminal conspiracy" seemed impossible to say, yet there it was, being broadcast into millions of homes Buckingham. Palace's communications team worked frantically to prepare an official statement that would somehow explain the inexplicable. How do you tell the British people and the world that their queen has been arrested for crimes that could send her to prison for the rest of her life? Every word would be scrutinized, and the statement would become one of the most important documents in royal history. The Queen's security detail. Men and women who had sworn an oath to protect her life with their own watched helplessly as she was led away in handcuffs. Some of them had taken bullets for lesser royals. Now they were forced to stand aside while the woman they had protected was arrested. The contradiction between their oath and their duty to uphold the law created an emotional conflict that would haunt them forever. Financial markets around the world reacted with shock and uncertainty to the news emerging from London. The British pound dropped sharply as investors worried about political instability, and trading was suspended on several exchanges as analysts tried to assess the implications of having a criminal queen. The economic impact of the scandal would be felt for months or even years to come. In small towns and villages across Britain, people gathered around television sets in pubs and community centers, watching in stunned silence as their queen was led away in chains. Many had lived their entire lives under the reign of the royal family and had never imagined they would witness such a fall from grace. Old women wept openly while men shook their heads in disbelief and disappointment. The Queen maintained what dignity she could as she approached the palace's main entrance. Despite everything, years of royal training had taught her to keep her chin up and her shoulders straight even in the most difficult circumstances. But the clicking of the handcuffs with each step served as a constant reminder that her royal privileges had been stripped away by her own criminal choices. Detective Inspector Collins spoke quietly into her radio, confirming that the arrest had been completed without incident and that they were proceeding to the transport vehicle. Her voice remained steady and professional, but she later admitted that her hands were shaking as she realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had just arrested the Queen of England, and there was no going back from this moment. The massive oak doors of Buckingham Palace swung open, revealing the scene that would be replayed on television screens around the world for decades to come. Queen Camilla, flanked by police officers, stepped into the bright morning sunlight with handcuffs glinting on her wrists. The flash of cameras erupted like lightning, as hundreds of photographers captured the moment. When British royalty met the reality of criminal justice, the crowd outside the palace gates fell into stunned silence. Tourists who had come to take selfies with the royal residents found themselves witnessing history in the making. Children pointed in confusion while their parents tried to explain something that they themselves could barely comprehend. The woman who had waved from the palace balcony during countless state occasions was now being led away as a criminal suspect. Television reporter James Mitchell struggled to find words adequate for the moment. His voice cracked with emotion as he provided live commentary to millions of viewers watching around the globe. He had covered royal events for 20 years, from weddings to funerals. But nothing had prepared him for the surreal sight of a queen being arrested in front of her own palace. The police transport vehicle waited with its doors open, a stark black reminder that royal privilege could not protect against the consequences of criminal behavior. Detective Inspector Collins guided Camilla toward the vehicle while maintaining the respectful but firm approach that the situation demanded. Every step was captured by dozens of cameras, creating images that would define this moment in history. Inside the palace, staff members pressed their faces against windows to witness the unprecedented scene unfolding in the courtyard below. Some crossed themselves in prayer, others simply stood in shocked silence. The head gardener, who had tended the palace roses for 40 years, found himself weeping as he watched the woman who had often complimented his flower arrangements being led away in chains. King Charles appeared briefly at one of the upper windows, his silhouette visible to those watching from below. Palace observers noted that he remained there for only a few seconds before stepping back into the shadows, unable to bear the sight of his wife's public humiliation. The pain on his face was evident even from a distance, and photographers captured the moment when a king's heart broke in full view of the world. The Queen's legal team arrived in a convoy of expensive cars, but they were too late to prevent the arrest. Robert Blackwood, her primary attorney, stepped out of his Rolls-Royce just as his client was being placed into the police vehicle. He immediately began making phone calls to judges and government officials, though he knew that the evidence against the Queen was so overwhelming that legal technicalities would provide little protection. European news networks interrupted their regular programming to carry live coverage of the arrest. In France, Germany, and Italy, members of Camilla's criminal network were being simultaneously arrested. Viewers watched in fascination as the scandal unfolded across the continent. The scope of the criminal conspiracy was becoming clear, and the Queen's involvement appeared to be central to the entire operation. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hart faced the most challenging crisis of her political career as she prepared to address the nation. Her speechwriters struggled to find language that would acknowledge the severity of the situation while maintaining confidence in British institutions. The arrest of a sitting monarch raised constitutional questions that had never been tested in modern British history. The palace guards maintained their ceremonial positions despite the chaos surrounding them. Their red uniforms and tall black hats provided a stark contrast to the scene of criminal arrest taking place just meters away. These soldiers had sworn an oath to protect the crown, but now they were witnessing the crown itself being tarnished by the actions of the woman who wore. Its social media exploded with reactions from around the world as images and videos of the arrest spread across every platform. The hashtag #QueenArrested became the #1 trending topic globally within minutes. Comments ranged from shock and disbelief to expressions of satisfaction that justice was finally being served, regardless of social status or royal titles. The Queen's personal chaplain, who had conducted private prayer sessions with her every week for the past 3 years, felt his faith shaken to its core. He had believed he was counseling a woman of deep moral conviction and genuine concern for the welfare of others. The revelation that she had been stealing from charities and collaborating with criminals made him question his ability to judge human character. Financial advisors around the world worked frantically to assess the impact of the royal scandal on global markets. The British pound continued to fall as investors, worried about political instability and the potential for other hidden scandals to emerge. Royal-themed tourism stocks plummeted as travel companies, worried about the impact on Britain's most important industry. Inside the police transport vehicle, Camilla sat in silence for the first time since her arrest. The reality of her situation was finally beginning to sink. And as she listened to the crowd's reactions through the vehicle's windows, the cheers and applause that had once greeted her public appearances had been replaced by shouting. Reporters and clicking cameras capturing her fall from grace. Detective Inspector Collins reviewed her notes as the vehicle prepared to leave the palace grounds. The case against the Queen was solid. She knew that prosecuting a member of the royal family would present unique challenges. Every piece of evidence would be scrutinized by the best legal minds in the country, and any procedural error could result in the case being dismissed on technical grounds. The Archbishop of Canterbury received urgent calls from religious leaders around the world seeking guidance on how to respond to the crisis. The Church of England's relationship with the monarchy was fundamental to both institutions, and the arrest of a queen on serious criminal charges raised theological questions about divine appointment and moral authority that had no easy answers. Palace staff began the difficult process of removing all traces of Queen Camilla from the royal residence. Portraits were taken down, personal belongings were packed away, and official documents bearing her signature were secured as potential evidence. The erasure of her presence from the palace happened with surprising speed, as if the building itself was rejecting the memory of her crimes. International leaders watched the unfolding crisis with a mixture of fascination and concern. The stability of one of the world's oldest monarchies was being tested in real time, and the implications for global politics were still unclear. Some saw it as evidence that no one was above the law, while others worried about the impact on international relationships and diplomatic protocols. The Queen's former friends and social connections began distancing themselves from her as news of the arrest spread. Women who had attended charity galas and state dinners with her suddenly found their phones ringing with reporters asking for comments. Many claimed they had never been close to the Queen and had no knowledge of her alleged criminal activities. As the police vehicle pulled away from Buckingham Palace, Camilla took one last look at the residence that had been her home and symbol of her power. The golden gates and magnificent architecture that had once represented her elevated status now seemed like prison bars, keeping her locked out of a life that she would never be able to return to. The crowd began to applaud as the vehicle carrying the former Queen disappeared. Down the mall, the sound started slowly, with just a few people clapping. But it grew into thunderous approval as thousands of voices joined in celebration that justice was finally being served. The palace itself seemed to echo with the sound of applause, as if the ancient stones were expressing their relief that the corruption within had finally been exposed and removed. The police station had never seen anything like it. News vans lined the street for blocks in every direction, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters from every major news organization in the world had descended on the modest building that would now hold the former Queen of England. The mundane police facility had suddenly become the center of global attention. Inside the station, officers struggled to maintain normal operations while processing the most famous criminal suspect in their history. The booking desk that typically handled petty thieves and drunk drivers was now preparing to register a woman who had once commanded the respect of presidents and prime ministers. Every officer in the building understood that their actions would be scrutinized for years to come. Detective Inspector Collins completed her paperwork with meticulous care, knowing that any error could provide grounds for the Queen's legal team to challenge the arrest. Each form was filled out in precise handwriting. Each procedure followed exactly as prescribed by law. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she realized that she was creating documents that would be studied by legal scholars for generations. Camilla sat in the holding cell wearing a standard orange jumpsuit that replaced her elegant royal attire. The transformation was startling and symbolic. The woman who had worn crowns and tiaras now wore the uniform of accused criminals. Her jewelry had been removed and catalogued as personal effects, leaving her looking ordinary and vulnerable for the first time in decades. King Charles remained in his private study, refusing to see visitors or take phone calls from world leaders offering their support. The official portrait of his wedding to Camilla hung on the wall before him, mocking the happiness they had once shared. His advisors waited outside, knowing that the king needed time to process the complete destruction of his marriage and the threat to his monarchy. The Queen's legal team assembled in the station's conference room, spreading files and documents across the table as they prepared for the most important case of their careers. Robert Blackwood had defended murderers and corporate executives, but representing a member of the royal family accused of international crimes presented challenges he had never faced. Every legal strategy would be dissected by media, experts, and academic lawyers. Television networks around the world provided continuous coverage of the developing story. Royal correspondents who had spent decades reporting on ceremonial events and charity appearances found themselves analyzing criminal charges and discussing prison sentences. The contrast between their usual coverage of state dinners and this criminal proceeding created a surreal atmosphere in newsrooms across the globe. Evidence technicians worked around the clock to process the mountain of financial documents, phone records, and digital communications that had been seized from the Queen's private office. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of her involvement in the criminal conspiracy that had operated under the cover of her royal position. The scope of her crimes was even more extensive than investigators had initially suspected. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hart addressed the nation from Downing Street, her words carefully chosen to balance the need for transparency with the requirement to maintain confidence in British institutions, she assured the public that justice would be served regardless of titles or status, while promising that the monarchy itself would survive this crisis and emerge stronger. Her speech was broadcast live to over 2 billion viewers worldwide. The Queen's former staff at Buckingham Palace gathered in the servants' hall to watch the Prime Minister's address. Many wept openly as they realized that their employment and their way of life had been shattered by their employer's criminal actions. The head butler announced that counseling services would be provided for staff members struggling to cope with the emotional impact of the scandal. International. Arrest warrants were issued for several of Camilla's co-conspirators who had fled to countries without extradition treaties with Britain. The criminal network she had been part of included arms dealers, human traffickers, and corrupt politicians from across Europe. Her royal connections had provided legitimacy and protection for some of the most dangerous criminals on the continent. The Queen's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following morning, creating a media frenzy as reporters and legal analysts debated what would happen when a former monarch appeared in a criminal courtroom. Constitutional experts argued about whether she could be required to stand for the judge or whether special accommodations should be made for her former royal status. Prison officials began preparing for the possibility that they might soon house the most famous inmate in British history. Security protocols were reviewed and enhanced to ensure both her safety and the integrity of the justice system. The prospect of a former queen in Prison Orange created logistical and security challenges that no correctional facility had ever faced. Financial. Investigators traced money flows through dozens of offshore accounts that Camilla had established. Over the past 15 years, the total amount of stolen funds exceeded £50 million, much of it taken from charitable organizations that had trusted her royal endorsement. Victims of her crimes included children's hospitals, homeless shelters, and disaster relief organizations that had been deprived of desperately needed resources. The scandal sent shockwaves through the international criminal underworld as law enforcement agencies across Europe coordinated the largest organized crime takedown in decades. Camilla's arrest had provided the key that unlocked a vast network of corruption and criminality that reached into the highest levels of government and business across the continent. Religious leaders struggled to address the theological implications of a monarch's fall from grace. The Church of England's doctrine of divine appointment was challenged by the revelation that God's supposed representative on earth had been stealing from the poor and collaborating with criminals. Sermons were hastily rewritten as clergy attempted to explain how faith and justice could coexist in such circumstances. The Queen's former friends and social circle began receiving visits from police investigators seeking information about her activities and associations. Wealthy socialites who had considered themselves untouchable suddenly found themselves answering questions about money laundering and criminal conspiracy. The investigation was expanding beyond Camilla herself to examine everyone who had enabled or benefited from her crimes. King Charles made his first public appearance since the arrest, walking through the palace gardens with his head held high, despite the devastating personal and political crisis surrounding him. His dignity in the face of public humiliation earned praise from constitutional experts, who recognized his commitment to the principle that no one was above the law, even his own wife. The booking photograph of the former queen became one of the most distributed images in media history. The mugshot showed a woman stripped of all royal pretensions, her face bearing the weight of her crimes and the knowledge that her privileged life was over forever. The contrast between this image and her official royal portrait symbolized the complete destruction of her public persona. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the arrest and prosecution of the Queen, with citizens expressing satisfaction that justice was being served, regardless of social status. The scandal had actually increased confidence in British institutions by demonstrating that the rule of law applied to everyone equally. Many saw it as proof that democracy and justice were stronger than monarchy and privilege. As night fell over London, The former queen sat alone in her cell, wearing the orange jumpsuit that had replaced her royal robes. The woman who had once been protected by armed guards and surrounded by luxury now faced the same treatment as any other criminal suspect. Her fall from the heights of power to the depths of disgrace was complete, and there was no royal privilege that could save her from the consequences of her crimes. 6 months later, the Old Bailey courthouse in London witnessed scenes that no one had ever imagined possible. The most famous criminal trial in British history was about to reach its conclusion, and the world held its breath as the jury prepared to deliver their verdict on the woman who had once been Queen of England. Camilla sat in the defendant's dock wearing a simple gray suit, her face showing the toll that months of imprisonment and legal proceedings had taken on her. Gone was any trace of the regal bearing she had once possessed. The woman who had commanded respect from world leaders now looked like any other. Criminal defendant awaiting judgment for her crimes, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had won the lottery for seats at the trial of the century. Security was unprecedented, with armed officers stationed throughout the building and metal detectors screening everyone who entered. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as everyone waited to hear whether justice would finally be served. Judge Margaret Thompson, one of Britain's most respected senior judges, had presided over the trial with extraordinary skill and fairness. She had faced the impossible task of ensuring that the former queen received a fair trial while also managing the intense media attention and public interest in the case. Her handling of the proceedings had earned praise from legal experts around the world. The evidence presented during the 6-month trial had been overwhelming and damning. Prosecutors had methodically laid out the case against Camilla, showing how she had used her royal position to facilitate money laundering, fraud, and corruption on an international scale. Bank records, recorded phone conversations, and testimony from co-conspirators had painted a clear picture of guilt that her defense team had been unable to refute. King Charles had not attended any of the trial proceedings, but he had issued a statement through his legal representatives expressing his full support for the judicial process. The king had filed for divorce while Camilla was awaiting trial, citing irreconcilable differences and the complete breakdown of trust in their marriage. The woman he had loved and defended for decades had become a stranger to him. The jury had deliberated for 3 days before reaching their unanimous verdict. The foreman, a retired teacher named William Harrison, stood slowly as the judge asked if they had reached a decision. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as every person present strained to hear the words that would determine whether a former queen would spend the rest of her life in prison on the charge of conspiracy to commit money laundering. The jury found the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud against charitable organizations, guilty. On the charge of corruption in public office, guilty. One by one, the guilty verdicts were read out, each one hitting Camilla like a physical blow as the full weight of her crimes and their consequences became undeniable. The public gallery erupted in cheers and applause as the verdicts were announced. Despite the judge's repeated calls for order, outside the courthouse, thousands of people who had gathered to hear the results celebrated in the streets. The sound of their approval echoed through the narrow lanes around the Old Bailey, creating a thunderous roar of satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Television networks around the world interrupted regular programming to report the historic verdicts. Royal correspondents who had covered Camilla's rise from controversial figure to queen now found themselves describing her fall from grace to convicted criminal. The woman who had once graced the covers of magazines as British royalty was now making headlines as one of the most notorious criminals in modern history. Judge Thompson called for silence before proceeding to sentencing. She spoke directly to Camilla, noting that while she had once held a position of great privilege and trust, she had chosen to abuse that position for personal gain and criminal purposes. The judge's words were measured but firm as she outlined the severity of the crimes, their impact on victims around the world. The sentencing was swift and decisive. For her role as the central figure in an international criminal conspiracy, for stealing millions of pounds from charitable organizations, and for corrupting the office she had sworn to honor, Camilla was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The harsh sentence sent a clear message that royal titles provided no protection from the consequences of criminal behavior. Camilla's reaction to the sentence was barely visible. Just a slight trembling of her hands as she gripped the rail of the defendant's dock. Her legal team immediately announced their intention to appeal. The legal experts agreed that the evidence against her was so overwhelming that any appeal was unlikely to succeed. The woman who had once worn the crown jewels would now spend the rest of her life in a prison cell. As guards prepared to escort her from the courtroom, Camilla looked up at the public gallery where victims of her crimes sat watching. Representatives from children's hospitals, homeless shelters, and disaster relief organizations that had been deprived of funding due to her thefts watched with satisfaction as justice was finally delivered. Their presence served as a reminder of the real human cost of her greed and corruption. The international implications of the trial's conclusion were immediately apparent. Other members of the criminal network that Camilla had been part of were now facing trial in courts across Europe. Her conviction would strengthen the cases against them. The tentacles of corruption that she had helped spread across the continent were being systematically removed by law enforcement agencies working together. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hart addressed the nation once again, expressing satisfaction that the rule of law had been upheld and that justice had been served. Regardless of social status or previous position, she announced that a full review of royal finances and activities would be conducted to ensure that no similar corruption could occur in the future. The monarchy would be reformed and strengthened. By this crisis, the British people responded to the verdict with overwhelming approval, seeing it as proof that their democratic institutions and legal system were strong enough to hold even the most powerful accountable for their crimes. Public confidence in the justice system reached historic highs as citizens celebrated the fact that no one, not even a queen, was above the law. King Charles emerged from his private grief to address the nation for the first time since his wife's arrest. His speech was brief but powerful, acknowledging the shame and embarrassment that her crimes had brought to the crown, while promising that the monarchy would learn from this crisis and emerge as a more transparent and accountable institution. His dignity in the face of personal devastation earned him widespread respect and support. The woman who had climbed from controversy to become Queen of England was led away in handcuffs for the final time. Her orange prison uniform, a stark contrast to the royal robes she had once worn. As the prison van pulled away from the Old Bailey, crowds continued to cheer and applaud, celebrating not just the conviction of a criminal, but the victory of justice over privilege. The palace that had once echoed with her footsteps now stood as a monument to the principle that integrity and honor matter more than titles and status. The sound of applause that had begun with her arrest continued to reverberate through British society, a reminder that when justice is served, even the most ancient institutions can find new strength and purpose in serving the people they were created to protect.